By the high summer of 1851, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert stood at the very zenith of the 19th century. The architects of a golden age that seemed destined to last forever, together. They had transformed the monarchy from a decaying relic of the Georgian era into a shining beacon of domestic morality and industrial progress. The great exhibition of that year, housed in the shimmering, impossible cathedral of glass known as the Crystal Palace, was not merely a display of British manufacturing, but a physical manifestation of Albert's mind, a mind of terrifying intellect and ceaseless energy that had effectively taken the reins of the empire from Victoria's hands, leaving her to reign as the symbolic heart while he governed as its tireless brain. They were the ideal couple, a partnership so complete and intertwined that Victoria herself admitted in her diaries that she felt unable to make a single decision without his guidance. Referring to him as "my lord and master," a sentiment that was less a romantic affectation and more a literal description of her absolute, crippling dependency on his judgment. He was her private secretary, her political advisor, the father of her 9 children, and the emotional blotting paper that absorbed the ink of her frequent, tempestuous outbursts. Yet, beneath the polished surface of this royal idol, the foundations were beginning to crack under the sheer, crushing weight of duty. Albert, the uncrowned king, was a man possessed, driving himself with a manic intensity to modernize the army, reform the education system, and manage the diplomatic tangles of Europe. His body aging prematurely, his hairline receding and his stomach plagued by chronic, agonizing cramps that doubled him over in pain during state dinners. As the decade turned and the 1860s loomed, the Prince Consort was a man running on fumes, a flickering candle in a gale, working at a desk piled high with red dispatch boxes until the early hours of the morning. While Victoria, blinded by her adoration, saw only the infallible demigod she worshipped, failing to notice that the pedestal upon which she had placed him was slowly, inexorably crumbling into dust under the strain of holding up an empire. The year 1861 dawned not with hope, but with the cold, gray light of foreshadowing, a year that seemed cursed from its very inception. In March, Victoria's mother, the Duchess of Kent, passed away, plunging the Queen into a paroxysm of grief so violent and hysterical that it alarmed her doctors and forced Albert to shoulder the entire burden of state alone, shielding his weeping wife while his own health quietly disintegrated. He sat up late into the night after night, his face pale and drawn, writing dispatches with a trembling hand, ignoring the gnawing pain in his abdomen and the bone-deep fatigue that made every step an effort. Driven by a grim Germanic sense of duty that allowed for no weakness. Even as the sanitary conditions of Windsor Castle, a medieval fortress with drains that hadn't been modernized in centuries, began to seep their invisible, deadly poison into the royal household. Then, in November, the final blow fell, not from international politics, but from within the sanctity of the family itself, striking at the very core of Albert's moral universe. News reached Windsor that Bertie, the Prince of Wales and the heir to the throne, a young man whom Albert viewed as lazy, unintellectual, and a wretched caricature of himself, had been involved in a scandalous liaison with an actress named Nellie Clifton while stationed with the army in Ireland. To Albert, whose entire life's work had been to construct an unimpeachable moral image for the monarchy to save it from the Republican tides sweeping Europe, this was not just a youthful indiscretion, but a catastrophic failure of the Coburg system, a terrifying sign that the moral rot of the previous generation had returned to infect his son and undo 20 years of labor. On a bleak, rain-swept day in late November, despite being visibly ill and racked with rheumatic pains, Albert boarded a train to Cambridge to confront his wayward son, a journey that would ultimately prove to be his death sentence. He walked with Bertie through the damp, freezing lanes of the university town, his voice weak but his disappointment searing, the cold wind cutting through his coat and settling into his weakened lungs, exacerbating a condition that was already far more serious than anyone realized. When he returned to Windsor, he was a broken man, shivering violently and complaining of profound exhaustion, famously remarking to Victoria with a chilling calmness that he did not cling to life as she did, and that if he were to fall ill, he would not struggle, for he had no fighting spirit left in his hollowed-out frame. The decline was slow, agonizing, and confused, played out in the claustrophobic confines of the royal apartments where the air was thick with the smell of sickness and fear. The royal doctors, incompetent and deferential to a fault, diagnosed him with low fever or rheumatic fever, and refused to admit the gravity of the situation. Even as the prince began to wander in his mind, muttering about the green birds of his childhood in Germany and staring blankly at the ceiling of the blue room, unable to recognize the faces of his own children, Victoria, terrified and in a state of aggressive denial, hovered by his bedside, interpreting his delirious mumblings as signs of improvement, desperate to believe that her angel, the center of her universe, could not possibly be mortal, snapping at anyone who dared to suggest the end was near. While outside the castle walls, the public began to sense that the unthinkable was unfolding behind the drawn curtains. The end came on the night of December 14, 1861, a date that would be burned into Victoria's soul with the searing heat of a brand, as the great bell of the curfew tower tolled the hour. The prince's breathing grew shallow and ragged, the dreaded death rattle filling the silence of the blue room where the queen knelt on the floor, holding his cold hand and whispering desperate endearments that he could no longer hear, calling him her ist das kleine Frauchen, her little wife, in a heartbreaking reversal of roles. At 10:50 p.m., with a long, shuddering sigh, Albert passed from this world, and in that instant, the vibrant, passionate woman who had ascended the throne 20 years earlier died with him, replaced by a frozen, spectral figure of grief who would haunt the palaces of Britain for the next 4 decades. The scream that tore from Victoria's throat echoed through the castle, a primal sound of a heart being ripped in two, signaling the beginning of a mourning period so intense, so absolute, and so performative that it would change the cultural landscape of the entire world. In the aftermath, Victoria did not merely mourn, she constructed a bizarre, Gothic religion of grief in which she was the high priestess and Albert was the silent deity, turning the British court into a necropolis dedicated to his memory. She ordered that the Blue Room be preserved exactly as it was at the moment of his death, a mausoleum of memory where his medicine glass remained on the nightstand and the water in the basin was changed every morning for a ghost who would never wash again, for 40 years. His clothes were laid out on his bed each evening, his towel draped over the chair, and his portrait hung above the pillow where the Queen slept alone. A morbid ritual of denial that refused to acknowledge the passage of time. She commissioned a plaster cast of his hand and slept with it, and had post-mortem photographs taken to freeze his image in the finality of death. surrounding herself with memento mori that terrified her children and alienated her ministers. She draped herself and her court in perpetual black, retreating into the gloomy shadows of Balmoral in Scotland and Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. Refusing to appear in public, refusing to open Parliament, and becoming the widow of Windsor, a remote, almost mythical figure who communicated with her ministers through angry, black-bordered letters and governed an empire from behind a veil of crape. This seclusion was not merely a personal tragedy but a political disaster, as the years dragged on and the Queen remained invisible. The British public began to turn against her, placing signs on the gates of Buckingham Palace that read, "These premises to be let or sold." In consequence of the late occupants' declining business, and the Republican movement grew dangerously strong, arguing that if the Queen would not do her duty, perhaps the country no longer needed a queen at all. She blamed her eldest son, Bertie, for Albert's death, refusing to look at him without a shudder of revulsion, writing in her diary that she could never forget that he was the cause of the tragedy. A resentment that permanently fractured their relationship and left the heir to the throne drifting without guidance. Excluded from state affairs until he was an old man. It was a grief that bordered on madness, a melancholy that became the defining aesthetic of the second half of the 19th century, casting a long, somber shadow over the Victorian age. Yet in a cruel twist of irony, the woman who wished only to die and join her husband was condemned to live on, surviving him by nearly half a century. Slowly, painfully, she was coaxed back into the light, first by the rough devotion of her Scottish servant John Brown, and later by the clever flattery of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. Eventually re-emerging for her Golden Jubilee in 1887 not as the secluded widow, but as the grandmother of Europe, a small, round, immutable icon who symbolized the stability of the empire. But she never removed the black dress, never stopped writing to Albert in her journals, and never ceased to govern through the lens of what he would have wanted. When she finally died in 1901, the white horses that pulled her gun carriage and the white veil she wore in her coffin were not symbols of purity, but a final, defiant message to the world. She was going to her wedding, reunited at last with the man whose absence had defined her existence, closing the circle of a tragedy that had been played out on the grandest stage of human history, leaving the 20th century to dawn over a world that had finally lost its mother.